Ancient Rome was the most advanced civilization in the world. They built roads that still exist, laws that still govern us, architecture we still cannot surpass. They also brushed their teeth with human urine, shared one communal sponge to wipe themselves after using the toilet, and rubbed gladiator sweat on their faces as moisturizer. Here is the disgusting daily reality they never taught you in school. A morning in ancient Rome began before dawn, and if you stepped outside without watching your feet, you would have immediately understood why the Romans invented the word sanitation. They just didn't always apply it. The stepping stones you see at Pompeii were not decorative. They allowed Romans to cross streets without walking through the rivers of waste, human, animal, and culinary, that flowed through every Roman street every single day. Rome at its peak was home to perhaps 1 million people, packed into an area smaller than many modern cities. The density alone created sanitation challenges that the empire's greatest engineers struggled to address and largely failed to solve. The Romans who built the Pantheon and wrote Virgil's Aeneid also lived in buildings without toilets, next to open sewers, in a city that smelled, on its best days, like the worst thing you can imagine. The Romans built the Cloaca Maxima, the Great Sewer, centuries before most civilizations had basic drainage. It was an extraordinary feat of engineering. It also emptied directly into the river that Romans used for fishing, bathing, and occasionally drinking. Every Roman street corner had a public urine collection vessel called a dolia. Romans used them freely, in mid-conversation, without ceremony. The urine was not wasted. Urine was collected and sold to Roman laundries called philonicae, where workers stood in vats of it, treading cloth to clean it. Ammonia in the urine bleached and cleaned fabric better than anything else available. This was a thriving commercial industry. The trade in urine was so profitable in Rome that Emperor Vespasian taxed it. When his son Titus complained that the tax was beneath imperial dignity, Vespasian held a coin to his son's nose and said, "Money has no smell." The Latin phrase, pecunia non olet, is still used today. Romans brushed their teeth with urine every single morning, not accidentally, deliberately. Aged human urine, rich in ammonia, was considered the finest dental cleaning agent in the ancient world. Physicians recommended it. Poets wrote about it. The Roman poet Catullus wrote an entire poem mocking a man for having teeth too white, because in Rome, gleaming teeth were evidence of excessive urine rinsing. Catullus's insult was specific. "You have clearly been rinsing with something unspeakable, and your smile proves it." The finest urine in the Roman Empire came from Portugal. Portuguese urine, collected in large quantities and sealed in amphorae, was exported across the empire as a premium dental and laundry product. This is documented in Roman trade records. Roman tooth powder also contained crushed charcoal, ground bone, oyster shells, and dried herbs. The charcoal was genuinely abrasive and effective for cleaning. The oyster shells provided calcium. The urine provided ammonia. The Romans were not entirely wrong. They just had no way of knowing which parts were working. Roman women of the wealthy classes had extensive beauty routines, many ingredients of which would not survive modern approval. Urine was the gentlest of the components. What came next in their daily beauty regimen was considerably more alarming. Roman comedies written by Plautus and Terence are full of jokes about urine, digestion, and bodily functions, because these things were simply part of daily life in a way that our sanitized modern culture finds almost impossible to imagine. Roman public toilets were not the solitary experience we know today. The latrina was a social space, a row of open holes over a flowing water channel with no partitions between users. Romans sat beside each other, conducting business meetings and personal conversations while simultaneously conducting their business. This is the tersorium, a sponge on a stick shared by every user of the communal toilet. After use, it was rinsed in a bucket of vinegar water or salt water, and then left for the next person. Every Roman, from slave to senator, used the same sponge. The running water channel beneath the latrina seats was the Roman world's most sophisticated toilet engineering, and it created its own problems. Methane gas built up in the channels, and there are documented historical accounts of latrinae experiencing underground explosions that launched the contents upward at unfortunate users. At Pompeii, at Ostia, at Hadrian's Wall, the stone toilet seats survive. You can sit on them, people do. The oval holes worn smooth. The slots for the tersorium still visible on the armrests. 2,000 years later, the infrastructure of Roman hygiene still exists. The communal sponge, thankfully, does not. Wealthy Romans had private toilets in their homes, a considerable luxury. The water for flushing was piped from the same aqueduct system that supplied the public baths and fountains. But the tersorium traveled with the household. The private toilet's sponge was shared among the household's members. The Romans found nothing unusual about any of this. Their disgust triggers were completely different from ours. They had no concept of the germ theory of disease, no understanding of what the shared sponge was transmitting between users. They believed diluted vinegar water was sufficient cleaning. They were not entirely wrong about the vinegar. Public latrinae were maintained by the city, cleaned, supplied with water, sometimes decorated. You paid a small fee to use them. The infrastructure was genuinely impressive by ancient standards. The hygiene standards were not by ours. Roman latrinae were also spiritual spaces. Curse tablets, thin lead sheets with inscriptions cursing enemies, were frequently deposited in latrinae, addressed to Cloacina, the goddess of the sewer. Romans communicated with the divine through the toilet. This was entirely normal to them. The gladiator who had just survived the arena was worth more than his fight prize. His sweat, oil, and skin scrapings collected with a curved metal tool called a strigil were gathered, bottled, and sold as a luxury product. The strigil collected what the Romans called the gladiator's suitor, a mixture of sweat, arena sand, olive oil, and skin cells from a professional fighter at peak physical condition. To Roman women, this was the equivalent of a modern luxury serum. These scrapings were sold in ceramic jars at considerable expense from specialist shops near the Colosseum. Roman medical writers, including Galen, documented the trade. The substance was believed to contain the vita, the life force of supremely fit warriors, and would transfer some of that vitality to whoever applied it to their skin. Roman women rubbed gladiator sweat on their faces, necks, and arms as a beauty treatment, the ancient equivalent of a luxury cream. The philosopher Pliny the Elder documented this practice without apparent judgment. It was simply what wealthy Roman women did. The proximity of wealthy women to gladiators at arena events was not purely about spectacle. Social historians have documented a complex culture of gladiator celebrity in Rome, not entirely unlike modern athlete worship, but with considerably more practical application of the resulting products. Pliny the Elder's Naturalis. Historia, the greatest encyclopedic work of the ancient world, contains detailed descriptions of cosmetic uses for gladiator products alongside entries on astronomy, botany, and zoology. To Pliny, all of this was equally worthy of systematic documentation. Roman cosmetics used ingredients that ranged from the merely disgusting to the genuinely lethal. White lead powder, applied to the face to whiten the skin, was extremely toxic and killed many wealthy Roman women slowly over years of daily application. In comparison, gladiator sweat was practically medicinal. Famous gladiators had their image on merchandise, pottery, lamps, even children's toys. The most celebrated also had their sweat sold under their name, like a modern celebrity perfume line. A jar labeled with a champion's name sold for more than an anonymous product. Brand marketing in ancient Rome. The river Tiber was the heart of Rome, a source of water, transport, commerce, and religious significance. It was also, by modern standards, an open sewer. The Cloaca Maxima, Rome's great sewer, emptied directly into the Tiber. So did countless smaller drains and the overflow from public latrinae during heavy rain. The river received the entire city's waste and carried it, eventually, to the sea. Roman law required burial, but enforcement was imperfect and expensive. The Tiber received what was too costly or inconvenient to bury properly: the bodies of slaves who died without masters who cared, of executed criminals, of the very poorest citizens of the empire. The dumping of unwanted infants in the Tiber, a practice called exposure, was legally permitted in Rome and widely practiced. Unwanted children, particularly girls and those born with disabilities, were left at the river's edge or in designated public places. Some were rescued and raised as slaves. Many were not. Roman recipes for river fish from the Tiber appear in Apicius, the oldest surviving Roman cookbook. Tiber fish were consumed regularly by the middle and lower classes. The fish were real, they tasted the river they lived in. The Forum Boarium, Rome's cattle market, operated on the Tiber bank. The drainage from slaughtering, the offal, the blood, the hides went to the river. In hot Roman summers, the stretch of river through the city produced odors that ancient writers described with remarkable creative vocabulary. Despite everything, the Tiber was the commercial highway of Rome. Grain from the empire's breadbasket in Egypt arrived by sea to Ostia and was transferred to river barges that moved upstream to Rome. The city's survival depended on a river that was simultaneously its sewage system. You can see the mouth of the Cloaca Maxima today, where it still emerges into the Tiber near the Ponte Palatino. 2,500 years old and still structurally sound. The Romans built it to last. What they sent through it, they also built to last, in its way. The Roman dinner party, the convivium, was the supreme social institution of the empire. At the finest tables of Rome, guests reclined rather than sat, ate with their fingers from communal dishes, and the courses kept coming for hours, sometimes into the following morning. Apicius, the oldest surviving Roman cookbook, contains recipes of extraordinary ambition. Roasted flamingo with dates and cumin, dormice stuffed with pine nuts and honey, sea urchin sauce, exotic fish paste. Roman wealthy cuisine was a display of power as much as nutrition. The dormouse was a Roman luxury food, farmed, fattened, and served glazed with honey at the finest dinner tables. Apicius provided multiple recipes. The Romans had sophisticated tastes in tiny rodents. They also used crushed mouse brains as a cosmetic ingredient. The mouse had an extremely bad time in ancient Rome. Roman dinner parties lasted for hours, with multiple courses, each designed to extend the evening and the consumption. For the very wealthy, the question of what to do with the limitations of the human stomach became a practical logistical problem. Roman sources, including Seneca and Cicero, describe the practice of inducing vomiting mid-meal to continue eating. Cicero wrote critically about a dinner guest who had to be carried away from the table. Seneca described the practice, "They vomit that they may eat, they eat that they may vomit," as a sign of moral degradation. The famous vomitorium requires a correction here. The word vomitorium actually referred to the exit passages in amphitheaters, the tunnels through which crowds poured out, not a room for vomiting at dinner parties. That is a modern myth. However, dedicated spaces near dining rooms for the same purpose did exist in some Roman mansions, and Roman sources are explicit about the practice of vomiting between courses. Roman cooking at the wealthy level was technically sophisticated. Garum, fermented fish sauce, was the universal condiment, the ancient equivalent of both ketchup and soy sauce. Made from layered fish and salt left to ferment for months in the sun, it smelled extraordinary and tasted like concentrated umami. The finest grades were worth their weight in silver. Garum factories have been excavated at Pompeii and across the Roman coast, large stone vats where fish layers fermented in the Mediterranean sun for months. The resulting liquid drained off the bottom and was shipped across the empire. The smell of a garum factory in full production was, by all accounts, remarkable in the least pleasant possible sense. Most Romans did not cook. Apartments in Roman insulae, the multi-story tenement buildings where most people lived, had no kitchens. Cooking fires in crowded timber buildings were fire hazards the city could not afford. Romans ate street food every day from Thermopylae, the fast food counters of the empire. Apartment dwellers who had no access to latrina used ceramic chamber pots and then faced a decision about disposal. Roman law technically prohibited emptying pots from windows, but the law was widely ignored. Walking on Rome's streets at night required looking upward as much as downward, and yet, here is the paradox of Rome. The same civilization that shared communal sponges and rinsed with urine also built the greatest public bathing complexes in human history. The baths of Caracalla alone could accommodate 1,600 bathers simultaneously. In the baths, every Roman used the strigil to clean themselves, scraping off the sweat, olive oil, and dead skin that accumulated. This was genuine cleaning. The problem was the water in which they then bathed was shared by everyone in the pool, in a heated environment perfect for the transmission of everything the strigil had removed. Roman bath water was changed infrequently. The pools, shared by potentially hundreds of bathers per day in the public facilities, would have accumulated the biological residue of every person in them. Roman medical writers noted, without apparent alarm, that the baths were places where skin diseases spread easily. Exercise in the palaestra preceded bathing. Romans exercised with olive oil applied to their skin, then scraped themselves clean with the strigil. At public facilities, the scrapings from the floor had uses. Roman sources mention the collected scrapings of the gymnasium as an ingredient in some medical preparations. The frigidarium, the cold pool, was the final step and the cleanest part of the Roman bathing experience. The cold water inhibited some bacterial growth. The pool was also the smallest and least used, which is perhaps why Roman bathing statistics suggest that the warm, murky, sociable pools were by far the most popular. The Roman baths were not primarily about cleanliness, they were about social life. Business was conducted, friendships formed, political deals made, marriages arranged, poets read their work aloud. Bathing was incidental to the real purpose. Cleanliness was a byproduct of an institution built for human connection. Roman artists created entire mosaic genres celebrating food and waste. The unswept floor mosaic depicted the remnants of a feast as art. The Romans were so comfortable with the physical reality of consumption and its aftermath that they immortalized it in their most permanent art form. The engineering that heated Roman baths was genuinely extraordinary. An underfloor and in-wall heating system using hot air from furnaces that created the right temperatures in different rooms. The Romans applied genius-level engineering to the problem of keeping the bath water warm. The question of what else was in the water they left to philosophy. Ancient Rome was a civilization of extraordinary contradictions. It built roads that outlasted the empire, laws that shaped Western democracy, literature that still moves us, and every morning it brushed its teeth with urine. The Romans thought they were the pinnacle of human civilization, and in many ways they were right. The question history asks us is, what practices of our own daily life will the people of the year 4000 find equally baffling?